So our speakers for today are Sylvia Dee and Greg Hakim. Sylvia Dee is an assistant professor and climate scientist at Rice University. She's specializing in atmospheric modeling, water isotope physics, and paleoclimate data model comparison. She has an undergraduate degree in civil and environmental engineering from Princeton, and then a PhD in earth sciences from University of Southern California. She's been a postdoc at University of Texas. It says UT Institute. I'm assuming that's University of Texas. I might be wrong. And then Brown University. And she's also the developer of a water isotope-enabled fast physics atmospheric dynamical model called SPEDIA. I like the name. And a public platform for proxy system modeling development called PRISM. And then our second speaker for today, who will follow after Sylvia, is Greg Hakim. He's a leading scientist in the areas of weather analysis, predictability, and dynamics. His research interests include weather and climate prediction, hurricanes, past climates, and polar circulation patterns. His undergraduate degree is in math and atmospheric sciences, and then a PhD in atmospheric sciences from the University of Albany, if I'm not wrong. And then a postdoc with the Advanced Study Program at NCAR. And then he joined the Department of Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Washington back in 1999, and he's a professor there. He served on numerous advisory panels at the National Science Foundation and then NCAR as well. So I'll pass it on to Sylvia, and we can get to the seminar.
Great, thank you so much, Nikita. It's lovely to see some familiar names and faces in the room today. So hello, wherever you are and whatever time zone you're in. So I was asked to give a review and some updates on the state of the science for proxy system modeling. And so I wanted to broadly go over how we've been using proxy system models to do science over the last 10 years or so, and then give you some updates on what types of models have been published recently and ask for all of your feedback on where we need to go next. Broadly, we know that we have three types of data that we use in climate science. We have instrumental data from ground-based weather stations and satellite observations. We use climate models, which offer our only means for making projections about what will happen in the future. And then finally, we have paleoclimate observations, which are crucial for constraining how climate has evolved on longer timescales, multi-decadal to centennial timescales, which can be used to help us extend our information from the instrumental record. In order to maximize the usefulness of all three of these tools, we have to be able to intercompare them. We have to be able to combine them. And so to do that is not trivial. We have a major problem in that our general circulation models, our weather station data are giving us information about fields like temperature, precipitation, humidity. Our paleoclimate observations, by contrast, are telling us an advanced geochemical measurement. Maybe it's oxygen isotopes or strontium calcium ratios. And so these two quantities are fundamentally in different languages. In order to break down that language barrier, we have a few options. Okay, so how can we bridge the gap between GCMs and paleoclimate observations and not compare apples to oranges, for example? All right, so there's two ways we generally get around this. The most widely used is the inverse approach, where we essentially create a linear calibration over the modern period, and we predict temperature or precipitation, for example, as a function of the geochemical or other measurements we're making from our paleoclimate archives. So we can create a relationship that describes temperature versus tree ring width over the modern era, project that back in time, okay? But there's another approach we can use, which is a forward approach, where we go from the climate fields, temperature, precipitation, et cetera, and we predict the proxy measured value as a function of the climate variables. Those could include temperature, precipitation, or if you have a water isotope enabled climate model, you can use the delta values of precipitation or water vapor or soil water to feed into those forward models. And in many ways, water isotopes are really a common language that can help us connect between general circulation models and our proxy archives in many cases, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So I want to basically, in my entire talk today, talk only about this forward approach, where we predict a proxy value as a function of climate. And most recently, Mike Evans has coined this term proxy system models. So proxy system models take stock of the fact that a real tree here on the left is not a thermometer and it is not a rain gauge. And so we can build a model that essentially gives us a representation of how the proxy works with consideration for how complex the system is. So I can take climate information, run it through a proxy system model, and predict variables like the oxygen isotopes in cellulose, or tree ring width, or maximum latewood density. Okay, so we're basically trying to build a model that helps us characterize how the climate signal of interest is filtered by the proxy system. So what we want to know is, how does each proxy type filter that input climate signal? I like to give my students the analogy of a recording studio. When a band goes into a recording studio, you have singers and drummers, and all of that sound is basically magnetically put onto plastic tape or whatever it is, depending on whether you're living as a millennial or a Gen X or whatever. Could be a tape, could be a CD, who knows? Okay, so we want to track every single modulation of that initial sound, and it's ultimately recorded on some media. So in Paleoclimate, we have all sorts of different recording studio equipment that we ultimately measure in the lab. We have corals, we have tree rings, and they all transduce that input climate signal in a different way. And so we can build a model that mimics how that transformation takes place by taking stock again of how or what are the impacts of environmental but not climate related processes that govern the formation of the proxy. The original publication that defined proxy system models set this up in a modular way in 3 different submodels. So this is Mike Evans' work from 2013, and it's a really useful way to build proxy system models. The first submodel is the sensor. So this is the behavior of the proxy's sensor in response to environmental forcing. So these are things like the chemical, physical, and biological components that have some kind of response to environmental change. So for example, a coral, the oxygen isotopes in the coral skeleton are responding directly to changes in sea water chemistry and sea surface temperature. That's a sensor. Next, we have an archive model, which is, how is that signal emplaced? So for example, if I'm measuring leaf waxes in lake sediments, those leaf waxes have to make their way into those lake sediments, and then the sediment is compacted, right? There are things that happen after that signal is emplaced in a layer of sediment. So how does the sensor emplace the record of the signal into the archive? And then finally, we have an observation model, and this mimics all of the things that we do when we make this measurement. Are there dating uncertainties? Are there analytical uncertainties? How are the observations made? What do we measure in the lab? What are the uncertainties? So I like to talk about proxy system models as being a flight simulator. It's mimicking all of the ways that the climate signal is transduced by the proxy system. So how do we build these in practice? Let's walk through a detailed example, and then I'll give you some lighter examples. So for ice cores, for one example, first thing we do is say, what's our best understanding of how this proxy works? Okay, so we know that there's densification as the snow compacts under its own weight, right? So if we're looking at water isotopes in a layer of ice, the recent snow will ultimately compact. So we can use a densification model, which is a part of the archive submodel, because it's, how is that record emplaced? How is that layer of ice emplaced in the core we retrieve? We also know that there's diffusion that happens before the ice solidifies, when the air in the firn is mobile. And so the original emplacement of a climate signal, again, probably water isotopes in a layer of ice, might be smeared to a different position based on that diffusion. And we can simulate whether it's a long diffusion length or a short diffusion length to figure out what's the impact on the final climate signal we measure. So if I were to build a proxy system model for ice cores, we'd start with our environmental signal. We're interested in temperature, precipitation, water isotopes, and precipitation. Those 3 primary signals will first pass through a sensor model, which for ice is quite simply maybe a weighted by precipitation water isotope value, plus maybe an altitude or a temperature bias correction. The archive model has those big more heavy calculations that we just discussed. We have to address densification and diffusion over depth in the core. And then finally, we have an observation model, which will mimic dating uncertainties that may arise due to layer miscount, for example. And we can also add some error term that has to do with the analytical uncertainty on our measurements that we make in the lab. Okay, so this is how we build a full proxy system model for any proxy type we want. I wanted to specifically describe this observation piece. There have been many, many attempts in the literature. There's lots of literature out there on different ways to handle age uncertainties for tie point chronologies. So there's Bcron and Bacon and Clam. There's no shortage. And there's also a number of models that have been published like BAM, which are specifically for annually dated or layer counted proxies. And so just so that everybody is aware of these tools as well, say we have corals or ice cores where we are measuring based on annual density banding, we might have a year that's dropped, right? In a tree ring, it could be a fire scar, or it could just be a random error in our layer counting. So we can have stochastic age uncertainties that are applied throughout the length of the record. And we can do this as sort of a probabilistic model of those chronological errors with some rate. So as an example of how we might use this, I'm doing some work with Nathan Steiger right now, looking at the timing of volcanic eruptions. And we know that these ice core reconstructions of volcanic eruptions are incredibly precisely dated. They're replicated across multiple sites. And for example, the evolve2k data that was recently published has a really strong chronological timing. And so we can say, okay, max, maybe it's 1 year off. So if you can barely see the little cyan colors in this volcanic forcing reconstruction, we can use the banded age model to simulate, okay, you know, if we have a maximum of 1 to 2 years of wiggle room, or say we increase the dating uncertainty to a larger number or even larger, right, they really start to blow up. But, right, you can actually use this test to say, all right, well, if I evaluate some science question, anything that you're interested in, to see what are the possible impacts of these dating uncertainties on my interpretation of the data. That's how we would use this in practice. So I mentioned the flight simulator. Here's our full proxy system model output. We can get environmental variables, precipitation, temperature from a general circulation model, or you can use instrumental data. We have water isotope physics embedded in those climate models. We can then pass this through the sensor and the archive models to look at the explicit impacts of diffusion on the measured ice core signal and look at the difference. And then finally, we can apply these observational or age model uncertainties to see how quote unquote messed up the signal could potentially get. So we can go through this exercise for any different proxy system. There have been many proxy system models published for karst systems and for speleothem archives. Again, we have to check ourselves and remind ourselves that a speleothem is not a rain gauge, and there's many different things that happen to the oxygen isotopes and precipitation signal as it percolates into the karst and finally drips into a layer of speleothem calcite. So again, we can mimic all these processes in our proxy system model. We've also built, starting with the initial work of Diane Thompson back in 2011, simple coral aragonite PSMs that again respond to local changes in sea surface temperature and the delta 18 of seawater. And as I mentioned, we can repeat this process for any type of proxy we want. So the initial version of PRISM had corals, tree ring cellulose, speleothem calcite, and ice cores. The common thread linking all of these is their water isotope proxies. And so our impetus for doing this work is that there were many proxy system models that had already been published, but they were all in different languages. They were in MATLAB, they were in Python, they were in Fortran. So we needed a common model development framework to encourage the feedback and expand use. We needed some formal structure for building and comparing proxy system models. Our initial goals were that they had to be very adaptable, modular. People could add on, they could subtract, they could take and use what they needed. and consolidate intermodel redundancies. And we were very adamant about this, of course, being open source. So that led us to choose Python, which is not proprietary software and is open to everybody. And we were very late to this party, right? There are many different Python packages online that have been developed for earth science problems, from seismology to time series analysis. So PRISM was the brainchild of this need to bring all the proxy system models under one roof. As I mentioned, it was synthesized from previously published work. Our first version was high resolution water isotope systems, which was facilitated by the larger number of water isotope enabled GCMs that were put on the market. So the website, which anyone can go to, is just here, and we'll see this website again. I'll put it in the chat at the end of my talk. So what I think will be hopefully more exciting to this community is what's new. What have we added recently? So one of the newest additions to PRISM is we have a lacustrine or lake sedimentary archive model. It is a bit more of a beast because there are many, many sensors that can go into lake sediments. And so we have a lake energy balance model, which was originally published by Hostetler and Bartlein with modifications from Carrie Morrill. Right here's where we take stock of our lake surface temperature, all of the energy budget terms that are affecting lake water temperatures. It also has a lake level module if you're interested in hydroclimate change. We've added sensor models for the delta D of leaf waxes, GGGTs, Tex86, delta 18O of carbonates. And then it also has archive models for sedimentation, compaction, and bioturbation. And then finally, since most of these archives are tie point chronologies, we've added in bchron, which is widely used again for analyzing age uncertainties. It still has the same exact structure: environment, sensor, archive, observation. Our archive model for the lake sediments, again, has bioturbation. So this is just modified version of Martin Trouth's Turbo 2 in Python. And then it also has, you can give it a porosity profile so you can see how much change in the sedimentary layer height might affect the emplacement of the signal in time. Another great addition comes from Bronwyn Konicke's lab. So she and I worked to put together a leaf wax PSM. We know that plant wax reflects the delta D of precipitation, but then is subsequently altered by soil evaporation, xylem water, right? That's what ultimately gets into the leaf water. And then that leaf material has to be deposited in the sediments, which again can incur dating uncertainties. And so with this new wax PSM, we can start to play games like, how different is the delta D of xylem water from the delta D of precipitation? And it turns out the differences are large. So if you wanted to constrain, for example, how much of a change in the leaf wax delta D that I'm measuring could be due to evaporative enrichment and not from a precipitation signal, we can quantify that using this leaf wax PSM. And then finally, recently, Alison Lawman, who is a postdoc here at Rice, has done some really nice work extending the coral proxy system model that we originally published to be much more tricked out. It has a lot more complexity. It has really excellent extensions for analytical and calibration uncertainty. The depth to time transformation used to assign the chronology of each coral piece has been dramatically updated to better reflect what coral geochemists actually do to assign the age model. And I think this is a really nice example of how we need specialists in each of these fields to help us build better proxy system models that better mimic what we're actually doing in the field and in the lab. So you can check out that paper, just came out last year. Okay, where can I find this stuff online? In order to install PRISM, all you need to do is go to this GitHub page, you download the zip file, you say Python setup install, and you say import PSM, boom, bang, you've got it, okay? If you look online, all of the code on this website is available. You can download one piece of it at a time. All of the good stuff that you need is right here in this PSM folder. If you open this PSM folder online, you'll see there are folders for each of our different proxy systems that we've published. Okay, there's age models, other functions for mimicking analytical uncertainty, and each proxy system has its own set of code. Another exciting piece of news is that a truly amazing team of computer science undergrads here at Rice have built PRISM out into a GUI, or a graphical user interface. So for those who may be Python averse, you can now go to our online system and download the graphical user interface. I would really appreciate having more beta testing for this. So if you have students in your classes, or if you're interested in trying this out, please send us feedback about how we can improve this tool. If you download the GUI, you'll find that essentially you just input the parameters for your data, and it will create things like a time series with age model uncertainties. You can plot the power spectra of your data. So our goals are to have this direct translator for climate model output to proxy units. We're hoping that having these tools publicly available will help foster more collaborations between modelers and paleoclimate data generators. And we absolutely 100% need to keep making these models public, adaptable, and modular so that we can expand their usefulness. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here and sort of broadly introduce our next topic, which Greg will talk about. So we have these two ingredients that make paleoclimate observations more relevant for projections. And next, we'll hear about data assimilation, which basically allows us to fuse the physics information of general circulation models with our paleoclimate observations. And then secondly, as we've just talked through, PSMs provide a more physically based way for us to compare our proxy data to climate model output. And so there's a PAGE's working group called DAPS, and we had a meeting in Belgium a few years ago that was really excellent. And we talked through some of these applications linking proxy system models and data assimilation. I'm going to punt all this math to Greg. But essentially, when we do data assimilation, we take our climate model, we take our proxy observations, and we have to connect these with usually what is a linear calibration. We can also do this link step with proxy system models. And so we've done some tests between our labs, checking whether or not that linear calibration assumption is accurate, and whether or not our proxies can be modeled as linear univariate recorders of temperature. And so there's several publications if you'd like to learn more about that topic, or I can talk about it during our Q&A. We have done a lot of pseudo proxy experiments trying to understand the fallout of using linear calibration in the data assimilation framework. So my role in that effort is to try to help test assumptions related to using full nonlinear physically based proxy system models in the data assimilation framework. So just to conclude, if we think about our network of climate observations and climate data generators that we have to work with, we have climate models, we have proxy system models, we have observations, and now we have new exciting methods for climate field reconstruction, namely data assimilation. And if we can combine all of these approaches together, we stop making the inherent assumption of comparing apples to oranges. If we can use proxy system models, at least we can put climate data in the same units for a more level playing field comparison. So we can compare a computer apple to a real apple. Great, so during the Q&A, I'd love to hear what should this toolbox do in future extensions? What do we as a community need? If you're interested in building a proxy system model for a new sensor, please get in touch with me. And I'd like to also hear from you about what might be the most appropriate platform for ensuring continuity of these projects. As I'm sure you can imagine, many people contribute to this work. This is just a short list of the people who have been involved with building the proxy system models in PRISM. My student, Charlie Marshall, will be giving a talk about the Lake proxy system model at AGU. And I cannot stress enough how amazing some of my undergraduate research assistants have been in doing a whole boatload of software engineering to build the online platform that I could not do. So big thanks to them. And then I'll turn it over to Greg and just briefly mention that my lab is hiring postdocs in water isotope modeling. So if you are looking for a postdoc, please get in touch with me. I would love to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sylvia. That was really exciting. I learned some new things there. Yeah, so I'm going to tell you about the Last Millennium Reanalysis Project. And like Sylvia, I can't list all my collaborators here. In fact, she's not on my list. So I just put down the PIs that were on the main original proposal to NOAA to create the Last Millennium Reanalysis, which, as Sylvia said, is this fusion of proxy information with climate model constraints. So I'll say a little bit more about what it is, and that's going to involve saying a little bit about what data assimilation is. And you're going to see that, that graphic again that Sylvia just showed a few moments ago. I'll briefly describe also how data assimilation is different from other approaches, and it really comes down to the PSMs being the key ingredient. I'll then show you some results from the offline versions of LMR. I'll explain what that term means in a few slides. But basically, there's no memory. There's no model forecast that carries the history of the proxy information forward in time. And that contrasts with online assimilation, which is what we've been doing most recently. And I'll share that with you as well. Okay, so what is it? Well, it's a gridded global multivariate reanalysis. It's not the only one. So Nathan Steiger was on with Jason Smearden earlier in this series talking about FIDA. That's another one focused on hydroclimate. By the way, congratulations Pages for getting phase 4 funded. That's fantastic news. And the goal of this work is to be like a modern reanalysis. That is to have a gridded regular product that's multivariate and that one can use for looking at climate variability in multiple fields that's physically constrained. All right, so the LMR is on a 2x2 latitude longitude grid, and it's the same grid used by NOAA's 20th century reanalysis. So I'd like to recognize the sponsors of this work. I've been doing this for about 15, almost 20 years now, and NSF, the P2C2 program, has sponsored a lot of the basic science behind the work that was ultimately funded by NOAA to create this operational product. And the Heising-Simons Foundation has pushed us to extend these ideas beyond the last millennium into deep time, and I'll share a bit of that with you at the very end of this talk if I have time. As Sylvia's work with PRISM, everything here is open. The data and the code are online. I don't know if Pages are going to share this presentation. If they do, the links are there, but it's relatively easy to find with a search. So I'd like to recognize that the data assimilation follows a long history of work of doing climate field reconstruction. That's, as far as I can tell, about 50 years old now. So this is a figure from Fritz et al. 1971, using tree ring records to infer a spatial distribution of mean sea level pressure anomalies across the Western Hemisphere. And although this is for 1816, 1820, doesn't agree with what we see in the LMR, it's still the spirit of what they were doing is carried forward to today. It's very much similar. There was a lot of work in the 70s and the 80s building on that, which ultimately culminated in this very famous work by Mann and collaborators, extending these ideas to the multi-proxy realm. Tigme and Hoiber's proposed a Bayesian hierarchical modeling approach they called BARCAST, which is basically data assimilation. And the main difference with what we do with LMR is that we are replacing the data-driven parts for things that we can physically constrain with a model to take that burden off of the data. So the key differences in data assimilation from these earlier approaches are the proxy system models. So this is a forward model, as Sylvia said. It's in the sensible direction. It's physically motivated in the sense that these are estimates of what the geochemical and biological processes are that go from climate into the encoding. And we also have these prior estimates of the climate, which typically come from a climate model, but they need not. And perhaps the most essential part of this is errors in all aspects have to be well estimated. So errors in the proxies, error in the prior model estimation, errors in the PSM, and that will allow us to do independent validation to estimate the errors in the posterior, the analysis that we have and how good they are. So I could give you a whole 50-minute talk on paleoclimate data assimilation, but just to summarize it on one slide, It's combining models and proxies. There are a lot of details, and those details matter, but I can't get into them here. There are some broad categorizations. There are Monte Carlo techniques that break down into something called particle filters. So Hugh Goose and his collaborators have a long history of successfully using these techniques to do a wide range of climate science, looking at climate variability. By the way, I agree with Sylvia. That DAPS meeting that Hugh hosted in Belgium at Lavande-Neuve was, I think, a career highlight for me in the combination of great science, great pie, and great beer. So I'd love to do that one again. We have Kalman filters, ensemble Kalman filters, relatively long history in those as well. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And this online and offline is probably best discussed with this figure that Sylvia showed earlier. The two essential ingredients are on the left and right side. So on the left, we have the climate states. So this is where the model information comes in, all the relationships between the fields that we care about. On the right side, we have the proxies. So that's the thing that was actually encoded during the time of the climate. The proxy system model is the bridge, is the forward estimate. Given these climate states, we estimate the proxies and we make a direct comparison between those two things. What the model thinks the proxy value is in proxy units and what the actual measurement was. Given the error statistics of that and this prior error, the Kalman filter or the particle filter or whatever it is you're using is weighting those two things against one another. And that's why these error estimates are so critical. How much weight do we put on this innovation, the new innovation from the proxies versus how much we knew before, that is from the prior estimate of the climate model. All right, so too many words on this slide, but it's basically just showing you what goes into, what are the ingredients in the LMR. The proxies come from pages 2K, and it's really this synthesis that's enabled these multivariate reconstructions that a lot of us are doing right now. So this really was not possible before Pages came along and uniformly provided the community with a database for all of these proxies and their metadata. The climate model priors that we use mostly come from CMIP 5 last millennium simulations, and I'll talk about some emulators on those. We're using CMIP 6 more and more. PSMs, I'm sorry to say, are still linear and statistical, but we hope to get into PRISM more deeply in the future. We reconstruct the atmosphere and the ocean. And both the data and the code, as I mentioned before, are fully available online, both for the LMR versions 1 and 2 at NOAA, and the online versions are available on Zenodo. So here's an example, one of my favorites from the 2016 paper that we wrote introducing the LMR. It shows the reaction of the climate in the year after the mysterious eruption of 1808, 1809. And the main point here is that these four panels characterize some of the uncertainty that comes with the data assimilation framework. It's uncertainty in which prior model we use and which data set we use to calibrate the proxy system models. And the main point here is that they all look really similar. So the color fill shows you the 2-meter air temperature anomalies in 1810. And the contours show you the geopotential height anomalies at 500 hectopascals. And the key thing here is that they all qualitatively agree that there is global cooling, but there is a local concentration of that cooling at high latitudes over the Arctic, and especially over Western North America. Not all of North America, but they all agree that there's a pattern here. This wave pattern is very reminiscent of the Pacific North America pattern with a extratropical Rossby wave train radiating out of the tropical Pacific and enhancing the cooling along the west coast of North America. So perhaps that's why where most of the humans were at that time, the settlements in the eastern United States, as far as I'm aware, there were no notable agricultural disasters resulting from this one. According to this analysis, the temperature was probably above normal. Touching briefly on the verification, this shows you that when we take the analysis, so we have the result of this whole process, we can take the climate fields and run them back through the proxy system models and predict the proxy values and then validate that result in the proxy space. And we do that for the proxies that we assimilated and those that we did not. So these are the truly independent ones. And we also do it for the prior. So the prior, this is showing you the correlation. The prior is these bands right around zero. So the prior has no skill in predicting the value of those priors. And the analysis, the LMR does. That's what these color distributions show you, is that we have positive correlation with the proxy values. The different colors, the red and the blue, show you different time periods. So the blue is during the period when the PSMs were calibrated, and the red is completely outside that time period. And the fact that they overlap says that these are apparently stable calibrations. So let me transition now. That was all the offline stuff from the version 1 and version 2 of the LMR. Let me talk now about the online version. So with the online version, we have gotten past the big hurdle, which is these Earth system models, which we would like to use to make forecasts on the timescales of the proxies, which is annual timescales for these proxies, are very expensive and have low skill. That's a bad combination. So we are using emulators now of these climate models to provide lightweight, cost-efficient forecasts. And this allows us to preserve the memory from past proxies. So we're doing coupled atmosphere-ocean modeling and coupled atmosphere-ocean data simulation, which even in the weather world is still a frontier problem. This allows us to reconstruct SST and ocean heat content from primarily terrestrial proxies and validate against instrumental data. So briefly, this is just about the model and its performance. So this linear emulator was trained on the CCSM4 last millennium simulation. And what we're looking at here is the power spectral density of a free-running simulation of this linear model. That's given by the orange line with the parent model that it's trained on. So that's the blue line, that's the CCSM4. And you can see for sea surface temperature, the Pacific decadal oscillation, for Nino 3.4, for the North Pacific index, the linear model is capturing the large-scale modes of variability that are in the climate model. And in fact, what I'm not showing you here is that the model has skill similar to the CCSM4 on the timescales of the proxies. And that's really critical for enabling the next step, which is to use that model in the data simulation framework of LMR. And this matters. So keeping the memory of the proxies in time at the highest level, looking at the Northern Hemisphere average temperature, this black line here shows us compared to many previous reconstructions of that quantity given by the colored lines, the online LMR is colder during the medieval period than it is in all previous reconstructions, including the offline versions of the LMR. So we found that this is insensitive to pretty much everything we can do to change it. We've started at earlier times. We've used different proxies. We've calibrated the model differently. And they all point to the fact that if you can maintain the memory of those sparse earlier proxies, the proxies are making it colder during the medieval period. Now, we've also looked and found that there are multi-decadal periods in certain regions like the North Atlantic and Europe where it is about as warm as the mid to late 20th century. But they do not have a hemispheric footprint apparently. The bottom two panels show you validation against instrumental reanalysis products. So this is the Aura 20C validation of sea surface temperature on the left and upper 700 meter ocean heat content on the right. And the reds indicate that there's broad agreement between what we're getting with the LMR online and those instrumental quantities. That's also brought out here, again, comparing with these quantities of interest, global SST, Nino 3.4, the Pacific decadal oscillation, and especially the upper ocean heat content. It's a critical quantity for many questions in climate science. And the online LMR given here in the black line compares quite well with a lot of these instrumental products, which actually diverge getting back into the early part of the 20th century. But we know the one that we agree with best is Zana 2019, which is perhaps the most robust estimate of that quantity. Touching on the dynamics, this slide highlights the key importance of why the online matters. So this is showing you the lead lag relationship between sea surface temperature and upper ocean heat content. And in the offline versions of the LMR, it's a symmetric distribution. That is, there's no lead lag relationship or no lead lag preference between sea surface temperature and ocean heat content. But the reference models given here by the gray lines, do have SST leading. And in fact, the online LMR versions, the online reconstructions given here by the blue and the purple curves, also have that property. Although it's different in detail from the models, they have this idea that dates back to Hasselman 1976, that the ocean is integrating over the noise near the surface, that the SST is leading the variability in this slower component of the climate system, the ocean heat content. So let me talk briefly about some extensions. There are lots of them. I'm only going to highlight two here. One is sea ice reconstructions by Katie Brennan here at the University of Washington. She's a grad student finishing her PhD, and she's done this over the instrumental period using instrumental temperature observations and also over the last millennium using proxies. And then I'll touch on an extension of the LMR to the last glacial. That's Matt Osman's work and collaborators, which will be released in Nature tomorrow. Very timely. So for the Arctic sea ice reconstruction work, this shows the sea ice extent going back in time over the instrumental era to the mid-19th century. The instrumental reconstruction that Katie got using these LMR techniques on instrumental temperature data is given by the black curve, and the proxy reconstructions are given in the purple and the blue curves. And what they show is the familiar rapid decline of sea ice in the late 20th century, early 21st century. The satellite record is shown in the red line. There's good agreement between these reconstructions and that satellite record. The brown curve shows you the Walsh et al. Reconstruction, which is the most commonly used and most has the longest record of revision by John Walsh and his collaborators. And the main difference we see with Walsh et al. Is much greater Arctic sea ice loss during the early 20th century warming, during the period from the late 19-teens to the mid-1940s. But good agreement between what we're getting from the proxies and what we're getting from instrumental reanalysis. So that is the black line and the colored lines. Looking at the last 2,000 years, we see an upward trend in sea ice through the Little Ice Age with a peak in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, the rapid declines since that time. And there's a lot of variability that I'll talk about more in a moment. There's another recent paper that also does something similar, going all the way down to monthly resolution. And they don't see this multi-decadal to centennial variability in the Arctic sea ice, although I note that the ordinate here is quite a bit larger than it is in our graphic. So Katie's compared these results with Walsh et al. On a regional basis. So we're looking here at just the Barents Sea and also direct, completely independent estimates of sea ice from proxy measurements. So this is the IP25 proxy from Var et al. 2010. And we see something qualitatively similar. That is a peak during the crescendo of the Little Ice Age, decline during the 20th century, and a decline back further in time. All I want you to get from this last figure at the bottom here is that when we look at trends over the last 2,000 years, and we compare that with the satellite record, which is shown here with the red dot and the error bars, the trends that we see during the satellite era for any time period longer than 30 years, there's nothing in the last 2 millennium that compares to that. The satellite record is completely out of sample for the last 2,000 years as far as we can tell. And finally, this extension to the LGMR, as we're calling it, Osman et al. It's a long time coming, a labor of love. I'm very excited to see this paper come out tomorrow in Nature. We're using a completely different set of proxies and proxy system models. So these are based on sediment core proxies and their PSMs. As a result, the resolution is considerably lower. It's multi-centennial. And we also have custom ICESM simulations to get the 018 covariability with these proxies and to model them with the PSMs that Just Tierney has built. And we also do something called a transient offline assimilation, which is not quite offline and it's not quite online. But the point here is that we not only get a time series of the global mean temperature, which shows a very nice matchup between the LGMR and the LMR, But we also have the spatial patterns, the multivariate patterns, which we need to understand climate variability. So if you want to know more, check out the paper tomorrow in Nature. Okay, so I'll close by saying it's still early days in paleoclimate data assimilation. So if you're a student or a postdoc, this is a growth industry, and I think there's a lot of exciting problems still to be taken on. And the LMR provides one approach to reconstructing these climate fields, but there are many others. And as I note in this bullet here, compared to weather data assimilation, and I also have a foot pretty deeply in that world, what we're doing here is fairly primitive, and there's a lot of ideas that we can port over to the paleo side. So some possible growth areas. So AI and machine learning are the buzzwords of the day. And I think they will have an impact on the sorts of models that I described to you earlier. These linear emulators will have nonlinear extensions, and they're critical because we are not going to be able to use the full Earth system models to run ensembles for these Monte Carlo techniques over thousands of years. It's just not going to happen anytime soon. We are going to need these emulators. Multi-scale proxies and merged instrumental reconstructions are already happening. There's some really nice work in Bern with EKF 400. It's doing exactly that. And I think we'll see more of that going forward. The proxy system models are essential, and they perhaps provide the largest improvement per unit investment. We already have the proxies. There's a huge investment in that. We have a huge investment in the models. I think we need to invest a little bit more in the link between those two, and we'll get a lot out of that. And also for the proxies, targeting the proxies for maximum impact. So there's a whole framework for how to do this using a data assimilation approach. So we have all these sediment core records. They have not been analyzed. Which ones do you pull out of the library, pull out of the warehouse, and analyze? You can objectively determine that using data assimilation to target the proxies to analyze for a specific objective. All right, thanks. I'll leave it there.
So the first question was from Zhang Zhu, and he asked about how we validate proxy system models, especially when they can get complicated. So I would underscore the need for process-based in situ funding. So one of the ways we can validate proxy system models and all their submodules is if we have things like drip water observations from caves and temperature monitors, about microclimatic effects in corals and delta H, seawater observations. There are critical modern observations that we currently lack that would help us validate the performance of PSM. Sometimes those are available, and that's what we use. The second thing we can do is look at networks of simulated paleoclimate archives and simply compare them to actual paleoclimate reconstructions to see how well the model is simulating real records. We can look at things like the power spectra. We can look at the agreement and the age uncertainties. There's lots of ways we validate their performance, but in some cases it is difficult. The second question was about pollen and proxy system models for pollen data. This is a really great question that I've received many times. The issue with pollen is that we're going from temperature and precipitation to vegetation assemblages. And unless we have an interactive vegetation model in the climate model that can give us changes in those vegetation assemblages, it's very difficult to build a process-based model for pollen. Now, I have seen talks before where they were relating climate model projections to pollen assemblages. So I think this could be possible, but I would charge the palynology community to think more about this with us and work with us, because we have been asked to make a pollen forward model many times. And so Nick McKay and I have been talking about this for some Holocene data assimilation stuff we're doing too. But if people have strong ideas about how we would do that in practice, I'd love to hear them. Issues with Python 3 versus Python 2.7. For any of you who use Python, there can be really annoying versioning issues where there are incompatibilities with the code. I did have a software engineer help me update all of Prism to be compatible with Python 3, but it sounds like there still might be some issues there. So if you can let me know what those are, I can help resolve them. And then the last question was transport times for like pre-depositional transport history for tracers. So as you can imagine, things like leaf material or pollen sits on the landscape or in vegetation, and then it takes a while to wash into a lake. And the timescales on which that happen are not always well constrained. So one could imagine building a model that mimicked transit times. And there are measurements I've seen where people will measure detrital material in the core and date that independently from the age model of the core to see how offset they are in time. So there are times when we can get at that number. But I do not currently have a model that simulates that process, and I think it would be a really interesting addition. That being said, it introduces a lot more complexity because you would effectively need a catchment model for that location. And so anytime you need like site-specific geographical information, it makes it more difficult to apply the proxy system model widely or to a network of global sites. So there are considerations we have to make about the level of complexity for these models as well. So I think that was everything.
I think there's Jack Hutchings' question, unless you've already addressed it and I missed it.
So Jack said, many of us have been engaged in thinking about using tinkering with PSMs. Am I correct in stating the primary difference between traditional inverse models and forward approach of PSM is conceptual? With care, a series of inverse transfer functions produce essentially identical results to a forward PSM. Please interrupt me to make sure I understand your question, Jack, but the big difference is that for the inverse approach, we're using either linear or bivariate linear calibration. And for proxy system models, they're only designed like based on the chemical, biological, physical transformations that occur. And but it is true, for example, in the coral PSM, those coefficients on SST, for example, are coming from linear calibrations of measurement. So there are some pieces in the model that are just, yeah, reverse engineered from measurements. So it is a bit, it's different for each proxy system, but you're right that we are in some places using an inverse approach to determine like the prediction coefficients. It's not true in every case. Some of the models are completely physics-based, like the ice core model, for example, and the speleothem model. So it depends on the proxy.
If anybody has questions they want to get in for Greg or Sylvia, you can just turn on your mic and ask the question.
Yeah, hey, Zhang, great to see you. Thank you. So he's asking, can we say a bit more about the temperature evolution during the past millennium? Should we trust the online method more? You know, I think, yeah, that's a really good question. It really comes down to this coupled low frequency component. The getting the ocean right is really the key. And really all we can do, since we've already validated against the proxies that we have access to, is either to find proxies that are representative of maybe not centennial timescales, multi-decadal timescales, validate against them. But it's challenging. Even during the instrumental period, the ocean heat content is not well constrained. Even SST in the late 19th century is not well constrained. So I'd like to say, yes, you should trust online more. The lead lag dynamics in particular seem to show that. But I'd say we still have some work to do to rigorously show the differences and that they're trustworthy. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Hugus, we know that the climate models have biases in the way they represent teleconnections and covariance between variables that matter for data assimilation. What is, for you, the best way to account for those biases? Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So things like the cold tongue bias in the models, it's shared by all the models, well, almost all of them. And that's one of the most challenging biases. So we use multi-model approaches, and that works with a lot of these long-range teleconnections that are uncertain among the models, but are different. So the multi-model approach is the one that we've been using to deal with this. But it's those shared biases, like the cold tongue in the tropical Pacific, that create the real problems. And I don't have a solution for you that we're using for problems like that, other than to know that it exists. I think that's the first step.
Thanks so much, Greg. I think we're running out of time. We're on the last minute. This was also, unfortunately, the last of the seminar series. In case you want to catch the previous ones, I've put a link in the chat. And you could see all of the older seminar series as well. So both Sylvia and Greg have referred to some of the older ones, and they are really good. They're all up on YouTube. You can watch them in your own time. And I guess just wishing everybody health. And I hope you get to spend time with your family at the end of the year in some holiday. But thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thanks.